Mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on OSHA written programs. We're glad you could join us. My name's James. I manage webinars and events here at Triumvirate, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. And before getting started and diving into the substance of the presentation today, I wanted to give you a brief overview on what the webinar is going to entail as we run through a few housekeeping items. I know there are quite a few new people on the webinar today, so welcome. And for those of you who are familiar with all this, hang tight. I'll pass things over to our speaker shortly. So we'll move on to that next slide there, Rick, and let everyone know that today everyone's microphones will be turned off for the webinar. But if you do have a question or a technical issue comes up, you may use the questions box to communicate, and that's over on the right-hand side of your screen. And I encourage you to ask questions anytime throughout the webinar as they come up, but we will hold off until the end, probably the last 15 minutes or so, to address all of those questions. Finally, we'll be announcing an offer at the end of the webinar to help assess your compliance with OSHA regulations, especially when it comes to these written programs that our speaker is going to talk about today. So please stick around for that. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Rick Foote. Rick has almost 30 years of experience in the environmental health and safety field and is currently an environmental services consulting manager for Triumvirate. He's been with the company for over 12 years, where he's established dozens of successful EH&S programs for companies that have had few or no systems in place. So basically, he brings clients to full regulatory compliance, and each program that he develops is customized to individual clients' needs. And you'll see his contact information there, and we'll display that later on at the end of the presentation as well. So Rick, I will turn things over to you now.
Okay. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I know you can't say good morning back, but hopefully you will. So with that, let's get started here, because as James said, our focus today is going to be on 6 core OSHA required written programs. These are ones that, we're all doing auditing, or even when you review the OSHA top 10 list that commonly see has links to those. So this is not all-inclusive list of all of the required written programs that you may need. So what do we want to try to help you with today is I want to go over what written programs are required, what is required in each of these programs, and when do you need to update and even train on these programs. Because a lot of people will create their programs, but they don't necessarily update them or train on them. Recently doing an audit, I've seen some plans that were dated back in the 90s. So, and typically, there's call-in list of people and things like that, and it's never good when that information is totally out of date. So we'll get a little more detailed with that. So I think the biggest question that most people have is, do I need a written program for all of the OSHA regulations? I say, my personal opinion of being an EHS manager was always yes. It's nice to have something in writing that kind of explains the process of what I do, how we do it, and why we do it. Because that way there was some type of documentation that states that process. So when either an employee or if OSHA came in and requested information, I had something to back it up. Now, some of them were very elaborate plans, and of course others were just really an outline of different requirements. So, however, I'm not going to sit here and say that, yes, every regulation does need that. No, that's not the case. It is limited, and we will go over that individual list in just a moment. So, as I always say, and I know this is kind of like a second part of the OSHA auditing program that we did a few months back now, is I always say, are you ready for OSHA to visit and inspect your written programs? And that's really the gist of this webinar today, is to hopefully get you to start thinking and saying, I didn't realize that part of it was required. Or, wow, I haven't updated mine in a long time. Maybe I should look at it to ensure it's complete. Because as some, if not all of you know, the old days of OSHA, which used to be that we loved to have our written programs all in a leather binder sitting on the shelf, and they look great because it was 300 pages worth of stuff, is today they more want to look at and say, is it actually working? does this plan really reflect what you're doing in your workplaces? So it is now more performance-based than what it was before, when it was more about the actual words in the document. It's now, how are you sharing that information with the prospective people that's involved with that program? So hopefully we can help you with that a little bit more today. Okay. So I think this is you, James, correct?
Yes, we're just going to launch
a
quick poll here, and you'll see the options displayed. How prepared are you for your next OSHA inspection? The options are very prepared, we need some minor updates, significant updates are needed, and we're not really prepared at all. So take a few seconds there and we'll share the results. All right, I think we got almost everybody, a few more coming in, and we'll close and push the results. Rick, we've got 48% think that minor updates are needed, another 34% significant updates, 16% not prepared, and 2%, only 2, are very prepared for their next inspection.
Wow, only 2.
Got some work to do.
Wow, I always say why. Well, that's remarkable. Only 2% of you think that you're fully prepared. And it is tough, right? I always say it to everybody that being in compliance with the OSHA regulations is really a tough task based on the, one, I always say, is the complexity of the regulations, and number 2, probably the hardest part of it all is, and I'm sure some of you are going to shake your head and agree on this, is the human element of it, that these regulations, affect every single individual employee, and it's tough to get everybody to buy into it. So I can understand why some of you say, yeah, you're not really prepared. So like I said, hopefully we can help you with that today. So here's the agenda that I want to cover today with you. Is I'm going to give you a quick overview of all of the regulations that do require some type of written documentation. However, we did target just 6 of these specifically for this one because there's too many, as you'll see, to cover every single one of them in any depth. So today we're going to talk about Bloodborne Pathogens Control Plan, which is one of the regulations that I get a lot of questions about. Do I need it? Do I not need it? Who's required? So hopefully we can clarify that a little bit. Pretty much I would think everybody on this call is going to need some form of an emergency action plan. Also, a common one that's missed is a fire prevention plan. All of you, by this point, and I left it in, I decided to put this one in here, was the HAZCOM plan, because again, you should have been in full implementation by June 1st, so we're now at the end of the month, so hopefully everybody has updated that. We're also going to talk about a respiratory protection plan, and last but not least is a LockoutTagout plan, or really control of hazardous energy, for any of you that want to get real technical with it. With that in mind, most of you know, and some of you have seen this slide before, which is fine, but OSHA has been busy, so that's why we've decided to do this type of an event, was to, again, try to get you better prepared, because it seemed like a good majority of you, feel like you're not so good with preparedness, so that's why we are doing this. So, with that in mind, here's a list, and you can see here I've even included the regulatory citation on the right, of all of the different programs that need some sort of a written program. Now I want to stress, program plan, it's really just detailing out the actions that you are. So it is intended, again, to prove, all right, this is how we comply with that regulation. So some of these we're going to talk about, like I said, bloodborne pathogens, your confined space entry, an electrical safety plan, emergency action plan, fire extinguisher program. Moving on, we got the fire prevention, and you got fire protection equipment and maintenance plan. Any of you that are actually doing that type of work, like I said, HAZCOM, hearing conservation program. Hopefully everybody heard that, right? Hearing conservation. Hot work, for those of you doing any type of cutting, welding, anything like that, you'd still need some type of writing for a program that you have in place. Of course, we have our chemical hygiene plan, right, and the regulations. It's a laboratory safety program. We're going to talk, we'll talk a little more about LockoutTagout, machine guarding, material handling and crane safety. A very simple one a lot of people miss is the medical record access. So all of these need some type of documentation in order to say that, yes, this is how we do it. It's more of a, program to kind of say, hey, okay, we're all on the same page here. We're all doing things correctly. What I always suggest to my clients, too, is I tend to put together a spreadsheet that says, okay, here's all the potentially applicable regulations at my facility, and then I put together a matrix that says, is it applicable or not? And if it isn't, I just put a note in there saying this is why it's not applicable. That way there again, too, it's kind of helping you with that preparedness. And, again, inspectors tend to like to see that because they're like, oh, okay, you did review everything that's needed. And it's difficult at best to go out there and, try to figure out, what do I need, what don't I need? So more of these, right? We got mechanical power presses, PPE, powered industrial trucks, process safety management. Hopefully not many of you out there are in the PSM because that one's a bear of documentation. And they say respiratory protection also. Okay? So as you can see there, it's quite a large list of different regulations that require some type of documentation. So it is important that you all, review your own sites and see what is applicable, what isn't applicable. You can find numerous different spreadsheets out there that have this information. It's also available right on the OSHA website. Takes a little digging, but it is available. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do now is start to dive into some of these and to kind of break it down both from the applicability point of view and what should be in your written program. So with that, we will start with bloodborne pathogens. Again, this is that seems to get a lot of questions out there. Is this applicable to me? What if I'm exposed to blood? Am I, just if somebody cuts themselves, is that an occupational exposure or potential? Because as you can see here, we have the scope and application of the rule clearly states that this rule applies to all occupational exposure. The key word here is occupational exposure. And I decided to put in the definition here on that one and even if you read it, it may not be completely clear. Okay, but I always stress to everybody there's a key words in here are reasonably anticipated. So is this part of your duties? Remember, the main crux of the bloodborne pathogens came out for who? Okay, and that was more for medical type staff. That was the original part of the rule, but we have a lot of different research and things like that today that people are working with blood. So does that mean that it could be infectious? And if that's the case, then yes, you would need to have some type of a bloodborne pathogens plan. Using sharps, where again, is it contaminated with something that could be infectious? So you have to look at it from that aspect. What are you doing? What are you potentially exposed to? It's not as simple, real simple, cut and dry that no, yes, you're in and no, you're out. But believe it or not, I usually find that as less people are in, I'm sorry, let me restate that. Less people need to have the program than don't. So, okay. And again, so it clearly states in the rule that everybody that has this, having any employee that with an occupational exposure, has to create an exposure control plan. And the whole design of this plan is to really try to look at and research out how can you possibly eliminate that exposure or how do you minimize it. So this is everything from, preventing needle sticks to, splashes in the face, from doing experiments with the blood, so using the proper PPE, using sheathing on the, on your needles or anything like that. So what they want to have in the plan itself, it has to talk needed to be in this program and who needs to be in the program. Then from there, it says you got to put in there a schedule and the method of implementation for every one of these. How do you comply? Are you asking for employee feedback? Are you checking with them to make sure the program actually works? Here we go, then you got, if you're working with HIV or HPV, there's other requirements that will play in. Well, most importantly in here, my opinion is most important, is also the potential about the hepatitis B vaccination. again, because that's one of the more common type of exposures out there to, contaminated blood, if you will, is, hepatitis B. So you got to have the plan in there is how are you going to allow your employees to get the series of shots, then how do they get followed up and all of that. And yes, a lot of that's covered under HIPAA, but you need to also make sure that that's all well documented in the program. How are you going to communicate everything to the employees? Is that through this plan? Is it through a training? Is it through posters? What are you doing to do that? And then, of course, record keeping, right? How do you keep all of these records for all of the information that you have regarding this program? Okay, so other things in here, again, you have to have a procedure for the evaluation. How do you know, what are you going to do? What types of exposures do you think you might have? What kind of incidents have you had? Are you tracking those? Are you making sure that you actually did a full evaluation to determine, is the process you have in place working? That's the most important part of this, is it actually working? And you have to make sure that you have a copy is accessible to all employees. And as most of you know, there is an annual requirement for this plan for training. And, part of that training should be, before you do that training, you should do an annual review of your program to ensure that that program actually meets all of the requirements and has any of the hazards changed at your facility. So you have to go back and do some new evaluations and all of that. And please keep in mind, too, also, the training aspects on the bloodborne pathogen says that you have to, when you have the ability to have questions answered at the time of the training, which almost alludes to the basis of a live training. So, again, I already mentioned this, right? It needs to reflect everything. So sorry, I jumped ahead on the slide. Okay, so when you're reflecting at it, is make sure you put in here any changes in technology. This is a big part of it that people don't always do. When I'm looking at it, I look at the plans and it's like, okay, I typically will ask for, hey, let me see a plan, your old plan from maybe 3 years ago, and I look at the new plan and say, okay, it's the same thing. Nothing's changed technology-wise. Again, you got to kind of stick with the times. So you've got to look to see what else you can do. And you got to document everything that you've done. This is something else they look for. I usually say just put it as an appendix to the plan and say, all right, here's what we looked at. This is what did work. This didn't work, or it's not practical based on this reason or whatever reasons it is it all should be part of the actual plan that you're looking at. You also have to solicit input from any non-managerial employees. Again, this is mainly towards patient care, but I also say, it's not a bad thing if you have people working in laboratories. Have you talked to them about what are they doing? How are they doing? Does that actually work? Does this not work? Any suggestions for changes? It really helps you with the implementation for not just this plan, but for any of your written plans, is to get employee participation, because as you probably all realize, is the more you can get them to buy in, the better the plan's going to work, because they actually feel like they're part of something and they have an ownership of it, and that's really usually helps with that implementation. And you'll see in a lot of these, this last bullet that I put on here, that it says, right in the rule, in each individual rule, it says that these plans must be available, at the request of anybody, from the OSHA, if they should ask for it for examination and or copying. So, if there is any CBI information in there, confidential business information, this is something, you should be marking that on your plan ahead of time so that hey, we can't have this as virtually public information based on, the confidentiality of what we're doing. Okay. So what is the exposure determination? Again, the exposure determination lists out everything you need to have. So you got to have a list of all the job classifications in which you feel there may be an occupational exposure. I sometimes will say, depending on your situation, is, if there's kind of a grayer area between people that could be potentially exposed or not exposed, put all of that, again, in a spreadsheet and say, okay, this is why we feel these employees could be exposed, this is why they're in, and if you feel like the other ones aren't, this is why we feel like they aren't. So it's very simple in that aspect. So again, you're not missing somebody and saying, oh boy, I didn't think of that person. So at least if you got everything detailed out, it really helps. So again, you got to have the job classification, a list of all the tasks and procedures that they're doing. Again, if they're close, how close in jobs are they, and make sure that everything kind of fits together, because you can group a lot of like things together. Okay, and again, the bottom line is this last bullet on here. You have to look at the exposure before you actually give them PPE. So I know we like to look at things when we do like a job hazard analysis or a job safety analysis. We typically will look at these things and say, oh, well, okay, we put in all the PPE, the right PPE, so the employee's safe. In this aspect, it's saying, hold on, you got to look at it prior to doing all of that. Can an employee be exposed? If they are, then you have to include them in this program. Okay. Hopefully that was helpful on bloodbornes. So, and again, I know that may not be applicable to a lot of you, in the group here, but it is something you should evaluate and at least say yes or no, I need it or I don't. So with that in mind, I'm going to change gears now, and this one is applicable to everybody, is an emergency action plan. And what an emergency action plan is really, it's either got to be written or it could be an oral one, which is basically saying if you have less than 10 employees, 10 or fewer employees, you may communicate the plan to them orally, which all this is basically saying to people, what do you do in the case of an emergency? A lot of people say in case of a fire or something like that. Well, no, this actually goes further than that. It should be more about, hey, what are we going to do in the case of any type of an emergency? Everything from bomb scares to tornadoes to hurricanes to we can keep going on and on and on, right? This plan should cover all of that, because if you see here, it says procedures for reporting a fire or other emergencies. And a lot of people just will cover a fire, and I'm like, all right, what about a chemical spill? What about, God forbid, riots? Like I said earlier, too, I don't know, we're up here in the Northeast, so sometimes we get things called blizzards, right? I don't know where all of you are, but hopefully in a nice warm spot where you don't see blizzards. But, it all depends on where you are, that there can be any other types of emergencies, and it could be something that's just site-specific to you. We could have this type of emergency. Okay, then detail that out in here and say, how are you going to evacuate your people? How are you going to, what type of evacuation? Are you evacuating in place? Are you evacuating, the entire facility? What are you doing? And, then you got to also detail out what are the exit routes and what procedures do you have everybody follow. If, again, if there's any critical plant operations, what do we mean by these? Is things that absolutely 100% have to be maintained throughout the entire event. So these can be tough. One of the bigger ones that I have a lot of people, question about is this last one, which is the procedures to account for all of your employees. How do you account for all your employees? I have places that say, well, we have no form of doing that. And, well, how do you know somebody isn't trapped inside the building? Or, you really have to come up with anything. There are so many different options out there, especially today with, the dawn of technology. Is, again, it can be time cards, it can be, any type of a system that you have on a cell phone. There's hundreds of different ways of doing it, but you have to have a system in place to account for all employees. Doesn't matter where. Okay, again, you got to have in here if you're going to have people doing any type of rescue or medical duties. So in your plan, you may list out all your first aid or CPR employees, and you have, floor wardens or what fire wardens, some people call them. What is their task? What are they going to be doing? How are they going to go about searching every area? Are they going to do a complete sweep, or is it just a quick, hey, yeah, I ran through that floor and I didn't see anything obvious, so I ran out? That should be detailed in here. You also have to list out all the names and job title. Well, really, let me rephrase that. The name or title for all of the employees, that could be contacted that have very specific information about the implementation of this plan. And you got to detail out what are their duties. So you can't just expect and say, hey, John Doe, you're going to go do this, and you haven't told John what he's supposed to be doing. because that person may not be comfortable with the fact that they got to run back into a building where there was a chemical release or something like that. You know, granted, we're never going to put them in harm's way, so I don't want to insinuate that, but, you know, it might be to go check out a certain area or something like that, just that's in a safer area, but some people get uncomfortable, so you got to make sure they know what they're doing. Okay? You also have to do training on this, and again, you got to designate and train employees to assist in the safe and orderly evacuation of other employees. So a lot of places too, and a lot of fire departments, we hear this a lot. There's kind of a little bit of an overlap between OSHA and your fire department, but most places they say that they want you to do an evacuation drill, right? I don't call them fire drills, you know, once or twice a year. So this is a great way too to implement and make sure that your plan actually works. And then you're also supposed to do a review of the plan with each employee covered by the plan. So how do we do that? Well, I would say I do that part of my training. Okay, is when we're doing the training, and I use, you can do it in a big group, or depending on how big your company is. Sometimes I prefer to do it breaking out different sections of a company to say, hey, does this really work for you guys? And again, getting their buy-in really helps. And it's also, you know, anytime you change the plan, any responsibilities change, you got to go back to the first one here and review the emergency action plan with your employees. So therefore, it really almost comes down to an annual type of training, is to make sure everybody knows what's going on with the particular plan. Okay. All right. The next one here is a fire prevention plan, which I love this one, and it's always confusing. It says an employer must have a fire prevention plan when an OSHA standard in this part requires one. What does that mean? Okay, it basically says, you know, then it goes on to say a fire prevention plan must be in writing and made available to all your employees. Again, the 10 employee rule kicks in. So what's in here? Well, here's the key to this. So what makes it applicable is typically this, is that you have major fire hazards at your facility. So for an example, if you have a lot of flammable solvents or a lot of combustible materials at your facility, when I say a lot, you know, a large amount of them, then very good, the fire prevention plan is applicable. And most people, a lot of people I should say, will include this plan in their emergency action plan. They kind of tie the two together, but I always say make sure you reference that in your emergency action plan, that you are also applying with the applicability of this rule. So again, you got to have a list of everything you have. How do you handle your materials? What are the potential, you know, ignition sources and the controls? What type of fire protection do you have? Again, making sure how do you control the accumulation of these areas, and then any, you know, the maintenance of any of these safeguards that you have, such as fire suppression system, or if you have an explosion-proof room, that you ensure, you know, you do a review of the area to make sure materials that don't belong in there aren't in there, and items like that. That's all part of this plan. Again, it's just a detailed process that says what you need to do. I don't know if any of you are ISO out there, but in the ISO standard, it's always like plan, do, check, act. And in my opinion, that's a lot of what OSHA does, is saying, okay, when we're planning it, we're going to do it, we're going to check it. If something's wrong, we're going to act on it, and then we start, you know, going through each one of these things individually. So that's the best part of it. You also, again, have to say, you know, again, what's the job title or the name? So the people that are responsible for this stuff. You're going to kind of see a trend here that's always asking for this, is because they want to know who do we go to for the accountability piece of it. So that's important again, but keep these up to date. One of the bigger issues that we see with any of your written plans is that is not up to date. I remember going to a facility once and I was like, oh, can you show me, you know, X person's, you know, information, and when can I talk to this person? And the person turned around and said, oh, wow, you know, he died like 5 years ago. You know, and it was like, oh, great. So, you know, that's not a good thing, because that tends to mean, you know, that you're not reviewing the plan. You're not, what if somebody had an issue? They don't know who to go to. So that is important to keep this information up to date. All right, moving on. Next one I want to talk about here is HazCom. Is that everybody here should, this one I debated on keeping this one in the program, but I thought it was still good to reinforce one more time that the June 1st deadline has passed, and you should have fully implemented it, and you should have fully implemented and updated your HAZCOM program. And again, I think most people know that you have to have a written program. But I say that somewhat in jest, but again, we sometimes go to facilities where they don't have a written program, or their program is just so far out of date that it's not even funny, because again, you should have updated it to reflect the change in safety data sheets and all the different hazards, the pictograms, and how are you complying with the program? Did you come up with an alternative labeling system? All of those items there that you need to do, because it says you got to develop. Keyword here too is implement and maintain a program, which at least describes all of the forms that you have, labels, any types of warning. So what do you got in place? If you do anything unique outside of the plan, you got to document it in here. And again, because the documentation is, I hope I don't offend anybody with this, but it's really that CYA that you need to prove that you're doing things appropriately. So a big thing that we usually do not find is this first one, is that people don't always have the list of all the hazardous chemicals that are at their facility. One of the first things we do when we go, because this is part of your written program, right? Part of your written program says that you're going to have a list of all the hazardous chemicals at the facility, and that list, it needs to be kept up to date. So basically what that does is really helps us to lay out and say, okay, do I have a safety data sheet for this, this, and this? And it also helps to identify what are the potential hazards that are at the facility so that I can go and train my employees on those potential hazards. So that's why this list is so important, and it really is a great tool for your employees to know too, hey, I'm allergic to X, Y, or Z. It's an easy thing to associate with them. Again, so the next one too is how do you inform them if they're doing a non-routine task? So what is that? I mean, again, it might be certain things that it's not in their normal realm. So you got to say, oh, hey, all right, so, Jill, we want you to go work in this area. So now it's non-routine to them. So you got to tell them about all the different hazards that are associated with the chemicals in those areas. And so you would go back to your list of hazardous chemicals and you share that with them and say, okay, well, now you're going to be working with X, Y, and Z. So we just want you to be aware of that. And you're also supposed to, if you have any unlabeled pipes in your work areas, you're supposed to tell them about those hazards also. But as I always say today, you really should just label all the pipes. That one's kind of an older part of the rule, but it is still in the rule. Okay. For some of you, you have multiple employer workplaces, so I wanted to make sure you understood this part of it too. You have to make sure that you're telling them, and even any contractors or anything like that, too, about all the hazards that you have and what's contained in your hazard communication program. So what that includes is all of this. Any methods that you're going to use to provide them with safety data sheets and things like that. So an example is, are you going to bring them out to mobile? Or are you going to send them to a website? Or do you have somebody on, somebody else on the other side as there's a phone, hey, call this number, this person's standing by to fill in your information if you have questions regarding a safety data sheet or anything like that. So they want to make sure that they really know about what's going on. You also have to make sure you tell them about any measures to be taken, during regular conditions that they're working or any foreseeable emergencies. So you kind of got to give them a quick, I always say it's a quick education on, the processes of where they are, what are they doing, and why are they doing it. Okay? Again, you'd have to tell them too about what about the labeling system used in that workplace, because now it's a different workplace that they may be in. So do you have a different labeling system? So you want to make sure you tell them about any of those changes at the same time. Okay? So again, this is all about what are we trying to do here? Communicate, right? And I always say, what's the worst thing we all do? Communicate. So if you have a really good communication program and it really works, and this one is the one to me is the most important one, that you really want to go out and ask your workers, is this working? does this plan really work? Does this actually, does it make sense? Is this what you really do? Do you understand our labeling system? Should we reword the program? Just to better reflect everything that you are actually doing. So it's really good in that place, at that point, okay? So again, you have to make this program available to any employees, their designated representatives. This gets into labor unions and things like that. And also, if you are, again, if you have employees that travel, more than one geographical location, must be kept at their primary workplace facility. But, I've seen places where they actually will send, a copy with them to the other location, or make sure that it's available when they show up at the other location, is to kind of give a quick training, if you will, on those, and to make sure that everybody's up to date on the differences of the program. Okay. All right, so the next one we're going to move on to is a respiratory protection plan. Again, if I can see a raise of hands of people that have respirators at their site, which I can't see you. But anyways, again, so first thing you got to do is remember with respirators, is going to take a quick step backwards here, is remember the hierarchy here of regulation, right? You've got to try to do basically input substitution, get rid of the material. Then you can do some type of administrative controls, engineering controls, and then finally it's a respirator. So if you determine that you do need a respirator, well, then you got to put together this program. And again, part of this program says that you got to evaluate and figure out what is the best respirator for the process. So it can't be just that you want to buy the cheapest one, because guess what? In the written program, it says, hey, how did you evaluate this, so that you know that you have the right things. And it goes on to say, again, that you have to implement, again, establish and implement keywords, right? A written protection program with worksite specific procedures. What does that mean? Well, that means that in your plan, it should detail out, okay, this is where you got to wear the respirator. This is why you have to wear the respirator. And these are the tasks that you can complete when you're wearing that respirator. So it's a lot of detail here, and a lot of times when I look at respirator programs, they just basically say, yeah, we chose, a North respirator, blah, 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 and they wear it doing, what are the tasks that people are completing, how are they completing it, why are they doing it, so it needs to be a lot more beefy, if you will. So you also have to update, like it says here, anytime you change anything in your program, and in the program shall include the following. Again, how did you select that respirator? Was it, because again, you got to select it. Some people say to me, well, I just want to buy the cheapest one, which, always sends a wrong message to me. But I also say, no, why that? Well, because this one works best for that. You also got to document in there how you're going to do the medical evaluations of your employees. You're going to do medical evaluations before they're allowed to wear a respirator. What are the procedures you're using? Okay, to do fit testing. How do you tell them about, emergency situations? How do you tell them about, the schedules for cleaning and disinfecting, storing, inspecting, repairing, discarding, and really just the overall maintenance of the respirators. Again, one of my experiences has been, I remember seeing duct tape. We all love duct tape, right? Kind of on the strap of a, on a respirator. And I'm like, well, that's not a good procedure. Is that in the written program that says you're allowed to use duct tape? And of course it wasn't. So it was like, all right, there's a problem. We've got to make sure that our employees understand that. So again, you got to have all the procedures in here. How do they know how to wear it? About air quality, how much oxygen is acceptable. Again, all based on the types of respirators that you're wearing. You also got to have in here is all the training on what you're going to train them on. How did you train them? So again, very, very detailed information. And then last but not least is how are you going to evaluate the program? Because you've got to evaluate it at least annually, right? So what are you evaluating? How are you evaluating it? So those are the things that you need to look at and to make sure that they're all in place. Okay, even if your respirators are not required at your facility, you still have to document this. So again, it's all about the documentation, documentation, documentation. And you actually have to make sure, again, the documentation is going to say that you provide them with all of the information that's contained in Appendix D of the regulation that says information for employees using respirators when not required. So again, it's all about that documentation. So what else do you have to do? Even though they don't need it, you've got to still put all of this information in here that's saying that it is voluntary and that they're medically able to do it as long as they follow all of the correct procedures and they're not going to put themselves in harm's way. This is a key thing because people think, oh, I don't need to wear it, so it's all good. You know, you still got to have something in place, and it's not as simple as saying, here's a respirator, go wear it. Okay? All right, last but not least I want to talk about is, and I call it Lockout Tagout because most people know it that way, but it is control of hazardous energy. And what that is, I think most people know how this one's applicable, and this one could be a very, very complex regulation also. But it covers, you know, again, any servicing, maintenance, and all that of any unexpected energization. So what do they want you to do here in this plan is this is a little different of a written plan because it actually lays out, you know, other requirements because it says, what do you need? And a little bit of a play on words here, but it says procedures, right? But isn't a procedure a plan? So that's why I decided to include this one in here, is it says that you have to develop procedures that fully document how the employee is going to control that potentially hazardous energy. Literally just got on the call yesterday with a client that was asking some details about that and saying, well, wait a minute, my understanding is, you know, we can just have a generic program and that works. And I was like, no. Because it says it actually clearly states in the rules, right, that it's got to be specific. So therefore, you've got to make sure that they're clear and really, really detail out and say, hey, okay, I got to lock out this device and there's power coming into it, so I got to go over here to electrical panel, you know, 1, 2, 3, and then I got compressed air coming in, so now I got to shut off valve number 6. You know, that's the kind of detail that they look for in these types of documents to say, what are you doing, how are you doing it? Because it clearly states all the procedural steps for how do you isolate it, how do you block it. So, and I'm going to, this may not sound correctly, but I'm going to say it anyways. I always say to everybody, these procedures should be so detailed that anybody I know you got to be authorized in order to do lockout tagout, but I hope you can understand what I'm trying to say there is that's the real kind of detail that you want because, God forbid, people have gotten killed from not doing proper lockout tagout. And again, if you can detail it out as much as possible, you know, hopefully that'll prevent something like that from ever happening at your locations. So, because it does go into it, how do you put it on, how do you take it off, when do you take it off, how do you test it to make sure that the system actually works correctly, what type of devices are you using on it. You know, I really, really like taking pictures of the different equipment and then putting it that way to say, hey, this works, this is great because it actually tells me, you know, where I got to go and what it should look like and what way does this valve close. Oh, that's closed this way, because sometimes it's not that intuitive. Okay? So with that in mind, we're going to turn this over to, you know, again, to questions, but, you know, again, take away here, our focus here was on these core OSHA required programs. Now, please keep in mind that these are not the only ones, and I know I stressed this earlier, but I decided to pick on these in general, and please, I'm always open to saying, hey, is there other ones you really want to know, or if you want more detail about any specific one, that's very helpful too for us to know. So really the takeaways hopefully you have here is remember to review and update each of your plans on a regular basis. Please, my recommendation on this is, you know, I see it a lot, people have compliance calendars where they'll put in there, January, I'm going to review all of my written programs. People, we all know that's not going to happen, right? What I always suggest is spread it out over the course of the year. In January, I'm going to look at my bloodborne pathogens. In March, I'm going to look at, after, I do my other stuff, I'm going to look at a HAZCOM. And in, April, I'm going to look at something else. It really, really helps. That way there, you got it on a cycle, and it helps to, make sure that you're following each one of the programs and that they're fully updated. Again, if you change your plan, you got to make sure you retrain your employees on those changes, because you can't expect an employee to know something that they don't know, right? I always say you don't know what you don't know. So unless we tell them and they're properly trained, that they could be set up for a disaster, especially if you start changing exit routes and things like that. And really make sure that what you have in writing actually works. Again, as some of you on this call may know, that OSHA, again, is really, really, really pushing out there the implementation of these things and to make sure that they reflect your day-to-day operations at your facility. And if you can kind of make sure of that, that is really, really what you want to do. Okay?
Thank you,
James,
Rick.
I'm going to turn it over.
Yeah, and we've got some great questions coming in so far. We've got almost 15 minutes left, so please get your questions in. But I want to address a few that have come up pretty similar and asking, hey, are we going to get a copy of this presentation? And you will. Tomorrow morning, you'll receive an email with a copy of the slides, a link to the recording so you can listen back at your convenience, and a link to a survey. So we'd really appreciate your feedback. Before we get to the few questions, I also want to mention, as we alluded to earlier, we'd be making a special offer at the end of the webinar. As Rick outlined today, there are a lot of requirements that accompany these regulations. And to be in full compliance, you need to have all of these components required, in many cases, for these written programs. So I encourage you to visit this link. We're offering a complimentary program review. This is to review one of your written programs and to help provide some recommendations and improvements on inspection readiness and updating and improving your plans. And don't feel limited to what we've discussed today. I know Rick is familiar with all of the regulations, so we're open to that. I'm going to include a link in the chat box here. Send that through. As we're going over the questions, feel free to visit the page and fill out the form, and we'll be in touch. I'm also including Rick's email address. So I know if you don't have a question now, you have one later, jot that down and feel free to reach out to Rick. So Rick, to start, our first question is, are the plans being reviewed word for word or just if they're implemented typically?
I've seen both. I've seen where, I've had inspectors that look at them, when they say word for word is strong, but really in detail is to, say, okay, does it meet all of the regulatory requirements, number one, and then number two, what is the applicability? Does it really work out on the plant floor, if you will? So it's actually a combination of both is typical.
Great, thanks. And Brian asks, what additional written programs should be implemented for construction companies?
Oh, well, we didn't get into confined spaces, you got excavation, you got electrical, you got the heavy machinery. So there's quite a few of them there for, again, it's going to depend on the construction site and what's going on, but there is quite a few different other ones there that could be included also. That's just a few of them. I mean, you're going to have powered industrial trucks. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, PPE. So it's a lot of the same ones that we spoke about in that list, but there would be a few additional ones, like scaffolding would be another one, depending on the construction site.
Right, and do check out that list. So when we send the slides, I know in Rick's first 3 or 4 slides, we had all of the written programs there with links, so you can check out those regulations. And Brian, get in touch if you want to speak about one of those more specifically.
Yeah.
A question from Helen. Where can you find the spreadsheet of possible written plans? I can't find it on the OSHA site.
There is a document that OSHA prints off that publishes it. You need to go into the publications, and you should be able to find it there. If not, please shoot me an email and I can send you a list.
Excellent.
I'm trying to think of the name of the publication, but I'm drawing a blank, so I apologize.
If you have it, we can include it in our follow-up so everyone gets it.
Okay, that would be great.
Okay,
yes.
yeah, we'll follow up with everybody tomorrow. Follow-up from Helen, is it better to have several plans partially written or specific plans completed?
Well, I mean, my personal opinion is always it's nice, something is better than nothing that shows that you are at least trying to attempt to, meet the regulations. But, then I also got to say, well, the regulations say you must have them, right, and they must be complete. So, it might get you somewhere during an inspection that says, hey, we're trying to work on these, we're slowly progressing, but the but is if you did get inspected, not every inspector may see it that way, is they prefer to see the fully created and implemented program.
Sure, and we've got about half a dozen more questions, so we'll do our best to get through these. Thanks, Rick, for answering them, and for everybody for sticking around. We'll do as much as we can here. Ben says, we do a lot of work with old batteries, sorting, recycling, etc., and we're wondering where those fall under OSHA regulations.
For old well, HAZCOM will be in there, right? 'Cause you're working with chemicals, definitely. Personal protective equipment. Just off the top of my head, it could be hazardous materials. Regulations could apply in there, again, because of, depending on the types of batteries that you're recycling. If you're using any type of forklift or mechanical device, and you're going to have, powered industrial trucks, you're going to have electrical safety in there. So those would be just the ones that come quickly to the top of my head without seeing the operation. So there's quite a few that could be applicable in that regulation.
We've got sort of a clarifying question here. I know we talked about 6 programs today, and this question is, did I understand correctly, 6 procedures must be documented and the other ones should be addressed in a safety manual? That's the question.
Can you repeat that, James?
Yeah, 6 procedures must be documented while the other ones should be addressed in a safety manual. Is that a correct statement?
No, all we did was I specifically pulled out 6 of the programs that need written documentation. So, again, at the beginning of the presentation, I gave you a list of all of the OSHA regulations that require documentation / plans. So, no, to say that, these ones need specific ones and everything else can be in a, in a safety manual, they all can be in a safety manual as long as they have all of the required elements that we are laying out today. I have seen some safety manuals that are very good, and I've seen other safety manuals that are very vague and do not give the detail that's required. So I would say no to that question. It needs to be, again, wrong messages. This was just 6 that we chose. Mm-hmm. There is definitely more than 6 that need full written programs.
I know some people join late, so I do want to make sure that everybody reviews these slides in their entirety, so that you get that piece if in fact you did miss it early on. Here we have a question from Michael, and I think we just have a couple more and then we can wrap up. I manage building maintenance at a small educational third party. I am a company of 1. Do I need my own plans, or do I work off of the facilities plan?
I caught most of that, but I missed the beginning.
So it sounds like he manages building maintenance at a small educational institution, but he's just sort of a third party as a company of 1. Does he need his own plan, or does he work off of the existing plans from the facility?
He can work off the existing plans of the facilities as long as all of the, like, say for an example, the hazard communication program includes all of the chemicals or materials in which he is using, and he's not introducing on his own. I think it would, there's a few, of course the emergency action plan, right, is oral, so that can be oral because he's employee of 1. But I usually suggest in a case like that is if possible, make arrangements to do it as part of the facility in which you're working for. Even though you're a third party, you are allowed to work under their programs. So it might be best if he could do it that way, because otherwise it's going to be cumbersome to have to create all of this stuff.
Got it. Thanks, Rick. And I hope that clears up Larry's question. So I think that actually takes care of all the questions. Rick, we'll shut down a couple minutes early. Do you have anything to add?
Not at the moment, no. I think hopefully you guys you can take a look at your written programs and figure out, yeah, oh, I got them or I don't have them, and if you don't have them, then you got to get them. So, good luck.
Yeah, it's based on the poll. It sounds like a lot of people have some work to do, so yeah, please take a look. Use this as a resource, but know that there are other materials that you can leverage, and we'll include some of those in the follow-up too, with a link to the OSHA site and other resources. So jot down Rick's info, get in touch. We appreciate your time, your attention, great questions, and please do check out our webinars and attend some future ones. We're doing these on almost a weekly basis, so we'd love to see you back on. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a great rest of the day and a 4th of July. Bye.
Yep. Have a safe holiday.